I've said on more than one occasion that Glenn Greenwald is a lion. It's fair to say that I have been a big fan of Glenn Greenwald's work, everything from his argumentation or his ability to argue, but everything from his journalistic skill also. He was against the Russiagate thing, being one of those key people who would ask questions about it as opposed to going along with the typical line that the media in this country was going along with. Julian Assange in regards to the WikiLeaks cables. But more important, more apropos for this particular moment, was the leaks or the cables that Glenn Greenwald released dealing with Operation Car Wash. Essentially, what they found in Brazil was that the prosecutor was working with the judge. Am I saying that right? Essentially, Operation Car Wash was a wide-ranging criminal prosecution in Brazil that ends up taking political people down. One of those main people being Lula da Silva. Lula da Silva was part of the Workers' Party, extremely popular, and would have won that election in spades over Bolsonaro if it was not for the prosecution of Lula. Now, it was widely considered this was a political prosecution, and that was given that much more evidence when the person who was prosecuting him ends up being made justice minister by Bolsonaro, almost as a thank you for putting him in prison so I could win this election. The catch here is Glenn released leaked information about that, showing that there was collusion between the judge and the prosecutor in that case, meaning it was a political hit job. They did that entirely in order to get Lula off that race. It was so damning, in fact, that Lula ends up getting out of prison because of it. I'm going to read through the story, make sure I got the details of that part right. I mean, this is Brazilian news, and I followed the story when this first came out. I think it was maybe several months ago. But this is ancillary to what's taking place today. I've said Glenn Greenwald is a lion. I'm going to add to that one of the bravest journalists that I know. Now, the reason I say that is because Glenn has found himself a boo in Brazil. He's married the gentleman in Brazil, and they are living there now. Meaning he's not under U.S. press protections. He's in hostile territory. He's in hostile territory of an authoritarian, or at the very least, a regime that wants to be authoritarian. Glenn, publishing those articles, embarrassed that government. Not just embarrassed that government, let out the guy who that government got locked up so that government could win. Essentially giving him or Lula a get out of jail card, which allows a certain degree of political momentum behind Lula to put up a political challenge against Bolsonaro. You could imagine that Bolsonaro hates Glenn Greenwald. He's talked about having him deported once before. So today, when the news broke that it's called a denunciation in Brazil. What this basically means is a criminal complaint lodged against Glenn Greenwald that would potentially open the door for him to be charged with crimes. Their argument, or they're alleging that Glenn directly assisted, encouraged, and guided individuals who reportedly obtained access to online chats used by prosecutors and others involved in Operation Car Wash. This was the anti-corruption investigation. To be very clear, I want to make sure I get this exactly right in regards to Bolsonaro right here. Because ultimately, this is payback. Glenn had said once before that there may be charges against him for something like this as a payback from the government for embarrassing the government in this way. Basically, I had this highlighted. Basically, this is the intercept. I'm going to give you Glenn's perspective of this. Clearly, this is payback. And Glenn made the point that he was extremely careful to not do anything that will go over the line, considering he knew that they were looking at him. Not just that, he even makes the point. There was an extreme case that the New York Times points out that the Supreme Court, one of the Supreme Court justices, comes out in order to stop the government from looking into Glenn. Because they understood that they were doing that because they were embarrassed by the information that Glenn put out. There are protections in Brazil, just like there are protections in the United States, protecting the press and releasing information like that, regardless of how the information is obtained. I hope you understand what I mean. This is brazen. This is brazen. So The Intercept has given its response, but I'm going to give you Glen's. Less than 2 months ago, the federal police, examining all the same evidence cited by the public ministry, stated explicitly that I have not, nor have I ever committed any crime, but that I exercise extreme caution as a journalist, never even to get close to any participation. Even the federal police under Minister Morrell's command said what is clear to any rational person: I did nothing more than do my job as a journalist ethically and within the law. Now, Glen made the point that I will not be intimidated by these tyrannical attempts to silence journalists. I am working right now on new reporting and will continue to do so. Essentially, I'm not stopping doing my job just because you're putting out these threats. They also kind of made this point that this is a challenge to the Brazilian justice system, meaning whether or not the institutions within Brazil are able to withstand an autocratic government that wants to essentially attack and crush political and press freedom, using means that go beyond the law. When people ask me why I was against the impeachment thing with Trump, I kept making the case that selective justice is not justice. In Brazil, even if Lula committed a crime, say Lula did something, I don't know, he got caught jaywalking. The prosecution, especially if the prosecution had all of these other people that it could have prosecuted, but it selectively chose to prosecute Lula, it would be wrong. They're using the justice system in ways to attack their political opponents, to essentially do something that they can't do politically through the typical political process, and use the legal instrument to their ends. That's wrong. That's selective justice. Whether that happens with Trump in the way that the Democratic Party will let Bush off the hook but go after Trump for this nonsense with Ukraine, or whether it's there, it's the exact same thing. The fact that Trump is an ogre doesn't make the fact that they're using selective prosecution any better. It was onerous in this particular case. Needless to say, he is in hostile territory. Right here. The series of Intercept stories about Operation Car Wash relied on a trove of previously undisclosed materials and provided an unprecedented insight into the anti-corruption investigations. The revelations included schemes of purported apolitical prosecution. The revelations included a scheme by purported apolitical prosecutors to ensure that Lula's Worker Party did not win the election, prohibited collaboration between the car wash prosecutors and Moro, a controversial personal enrichment by prosecutors, among many of the revelations published in English and Portuguese. Essentially, the government got embarrassed by the information that Glen released. I'm going to go to the New York Times for a moment because the New York Times gets a little bit more involved in this particular story. So, right here, they were looking into Glen's finances at one point, meaning they were looking for anything to charge him with. After all, if they were willing to do that to Lula da Silva, literally using the prosecutorial mechanism to put Lula in prison in order to prevent him from running in the race, you don't think they would do that to Glen? They would love to see him get prosecuted. They would love to see him rotting in a Brazilian prison. When it became clear that they were looking into his finances in order to find something to charge him on, a judge, Supreme Court, those reports led a Supreme Court Justice Mendez to issue an extraordinary order barring federal police from investigating Greenwald's role in disseminating the hacked messages. Prosecutors on Tuesday said they abided by that order until they found audio messages which, they argued, implicated Greenwald in criminal activity. The one thing I cannot do is give direction, Mr. Glen Greenwald said. That's crossing the line. I was very careful. The prosecutor who filed the case, Olivia, last month charged the president of Brazil's Bar Association with libel for making disparaging remarks against Mr. Moro. Think about what we're saying. Somebody criticizes the Bar Association, head of the Bar Association, criticizes the government. And they try to get him for libel. That's extraordinary. So right here, let's see, charging journalists, right? There's a very specific part that I'm looking for that I highlighted prior. So right here. The news organization Mr. Greenwald co-founded, The Intercept in Brazil, published articles last year based on leaked cell phone messages that raised questions about the integrity and the motives of key members of Brazil's justice system. The articles cast doubt on the impartiality of former judge Sergio Moro and some of the prosecutors. Again, Moro, justice minister, he essentially, for putting Lula in prison, he essentially got a new posting. He got compensation for doing Bolsonaro's work for him. And some of the prosecutors who worked in the corruption investigation that landed several powerful political and business figures in prison. Among them was popular leftist. Among them was a former president, a popular leftist whose conviction paved the way for the election of Bolsonaro. Mr. Moro was the judge that handled the case. He is now Minister of Justice. Okay, good. I got it right. As I said it sounded strange to me. And so I was like, well, wait a minute. Maybe I got some of the names wrong. But no, it was right. He essentially got a payback for putting Lula in prison. So think of it this way. A prosecutor says, Mueller comes out, stern chin, I'm only in this to get to the bottom of this corruption. And there's all sorts of corruption here. And so I'm going to be the guy that solves all of this corruption. And he's putting that person and charging that person. And then you get to a situation where they go after political leaders, Lula being one of them. Now, the catch here is that what Glen exposed was this is not apolitical. This was not a situation where the person was just functioning under the notion of the law and getting people who are corrupt. He was doing it entirely for political reasons. Putting Lula out of commission was the way to get Bolsonaro elected. And for that, Bolsonaro gave the judge justice minister position. It's corruption on its face. When Glen published the details, meaning the back and forth information about the conversations that were being had between the prosecutors and the judge, well, that revealed the fact that this was not apolitical, that this was indeed a political witch hunt in order to get Lula off the campaign trail. And for a time, not just a time, they were successful. The catch here is Lula is no longer in prison. And the guy that exposed all of this in order to get Lula out of prison, because it was so damning when it was revealed, was one Glen Greenwald. The very guy who this government is now trying to find anything to go after. The press, believe it or not, is supposed to be adversarial. It's its job. Meaning, how do you know what your government is doing if you don't have an adversarial media to get to the bottom of that? Governments always want to hide what they're doing, especially things that embarrasses them or things that they know the public would not necessarily be on board for, whether it was lying us into wars or, for that matter, whether it's mass surveillance and then lying about the fact that there's mass surveillance. Governments lie. It is a responsibility of media to get to the bottom of it, not pass it off to fact checkers and all this nonsense. Investigative, adversarial journalism, it is something that we miss, and it is something that Glen Greenwald, especially at The Intercept, has done a pretty good job on. There may be failings in regards to the way they get leaked information. People have been getting popped based on whatever process they have in order to get those leaked documents. But needless to say, they have been doing extremely good work on this notion of adversarial journalism. What was the papers they put out? The car wash thing was a massive bombshell. There was something else that was a massive bombshell. It wasn't WikiLeaks. But I guess my point is The Intercept has been doing amazing work typically. Whatever you think of Glen, this is a jump of the shark. This is them literally going after journalists for doing their job. And if they're able to put Glen in prison for something like this, then everybody else is fair game. Glen is right. This is a test for Brazilian government, whether government can hold up, or its institutions can hold up to essentially a rabid, right-wing, authoritarian government. One of the bravest men we know. Glen deserves this. He said once that calling Trump or Bolsonaro fascist is downplaying the word fascism, so I hope this is a good lesson for him. Charles Pereira, I would need to see that quote, because I have yet to see him make the point that Bolsonaro was not a fascist. In fact, he often will make this point that Bolsonaro is essentially right-wing with authoritarian tendencies. So definitely send me the quote. But I don't think he deserves this. I mean, you're effectively saying that he deserves to be put in prison because he didn't necessarily consider Trump a fascist. I don't necessarily think that's true, especially the precedents that is set with putting a journalist in prison for doing his job. Yeah, I massively disagree with you on that one, Charles. Like, even at its worst, assume for the moment that I take you at your word that he did say that. I don't know what that has to do with them potentially going after him to put him in prison. You believe that it's okay for him to be put in prison in order to prove a point that you believe is a point. I don't think that's true. And fact of the matter is, if Glen gets put in prison for something that he did from the standpoint of doing his job and putting this information out, then everybody is fair game. The moment that he's put in prison, it sets the precedent that this notion of adversarial journalism and all this other stuff, the government has open season, and it can use Glen as kind of this jumping off point and getting that stuff accomplished. I massively disagree with you on this, Charles. Even if everything that you just said there was right, that he didn't think Bolsonaro was a fascist or he didn't think Trump was even if all that's true, why do you believe that justifies him being put in prison? And why do you think that that makes it okay? Well, I mean, he didn't think he was a fascist, so it's okay for the guy to be put in prison, put into a cage to satisfy your whims of that serves him right. No. No, I'm sorry. That's a fail. What is it like for a human being to be put into a cage? I mean, think about what you're saying for the moment. You're talking about it's okay for him to be put into a cage. Whatever you think of Glen, whatever you think of him, he's a journalist doing his job. And the notion that you will be able to put a journalist in prison for doing their job. Look, governments tend to hate reporters, especially if those reporters are good at their jobs. That's all the world over, especially in democracies. Glen is doing God's work, regardless of what you think of him. The notion that you could put somebody in prison for doing their job from the standpoint of the press is problematic. Supposedly they have taped messages or whatever else. Again, Glen made the point that the same information they're using is the exact same information that was used before, and he was giving a clear bill of health, of legal health of sorts. But that doesn't necessarily mean that they can't screw with him to see how far they can push it. And if they get the opportunity, yes, they will try to prosecute him. One of the bravest journalists I know. Like, share, subscribe. Thanks so much.